we build what we call interim supportive housing. We do it for about the cost of 1/10. It may not be there permanently, but people love it. They get into something that costs $50,000, but lasts for 10 years, let's say, so $5,000 per year per person, and $40,000 a year of care. Even if only 20% got back on their feet, that return on investment is immediate. But what we've discovered is that when people first become homeless, the vast majority of them do not yet have a debilitating condition that would prevent them from returning to self-sufficiency, about 17%. But being on the streets even a couple of months, that 17% skyrockets. And if you're waiting on the streets for a decade, there's no chance, generalizing, but that very many of those folks are ever going to return to being taxpayers. And so from an investment, return on investment, if we can get everybody indoors, some percent of them become taxpayers. Certainly those who are not going to be able to care for themselves are not on our streets getting worse and more expensive. The streets are not the waiting room. So the return on investment, both morally as well as, quite frankly, fiscally, makes all the sense in the world. When I say this is solvable, I mean unsheltered homelessness, street homelessness, which is only a small portion of homelessness writ large. And so I believe that we should be prioritizing getting everyone indoors, regardless of how long they get to stay there. And there are a couple of things people don't understand. One is that the cost of leaving people on the streets, that's about $80,000 per person per year. The cost to bring them indoors and give them 3 meals a day and supportive services and 24/7 care is $40,000. It's costing us twice what it would cost to solve the problem, to let this problem continue. The problem with that is that $80,000 is spread across so many budgets that you don't see it. The average cost per unit of permanent housing in our state is over $800,000. It's $1 million in our big cities like San Francisco and LA. And the result of that is for every one lucky person who gets that $1 million apartment, 4 become homeless. We're not going to solve it that way. We're going to have to do something different. And so in our model, we say, let's get everybody indoors into something that's safe, that isn't the quality that they would maybe spend the rest of their life. Nothing in life is permanent. Why do we care that where they are is permanent? They don't care. And so I think we should remove the concept of permanent anything and just talk about housing. What we build is cabins where people have their own room with a door that locks and they get to stay a while. That, by HUD's definition, is housing. Separate sleeping quarters and a habitual place of residence. Not permanent, but habitual. It's not an overnight stay.
For a city manager or some city official that's listening to this podcast for the first time, what do you think are like the first 2 or 3 steps that they need to take to start this process of going down a road of a partnership with DignityMoves and your team? Pretty good. Welcome to an episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Guys, today we've got some innovation on the podcast. We've got some outside the box thinking on this podcast because when I first heard about DignityMoves and I listened to Elizabeth Funk on what we call as a Titans conversation, hearing how she's dealing with the issue of homelessness in a whole different fashion. All we used to hear about is, oh, we're building homelessness housing. It's going to cost about $1 million per unit. And everybody's wondering what is going on here. What do I not understand? And here comes Elizabeth with a completely different solution for a fraction of the cost. And I was like, whoa. Let's get her on the podcast. So Elizabeth, welcome to the podcast today. How are you doing today?
I am great, and I love your energy. This is going to be fun.
Well, I'm genuinely curious. I really want to know how you're doing it. But Elizabeth, just for people that don't know you, who are you and how did you get into this whole world of interim housing? Tell us a little bit more about that.
I don't know. It's the short answer. I'm as surprised as you are. I spent most of my career in technology. I was at Microsoft right out of college when Windows was first being introduced, and it was a paradigm shift, thinking about Windows applications that are actually colorful and you could see the Lord is bold instead of a black screen with white text. And then after business school, I was at Yahoo back when we literally didn't have a sign on the door. We were so making it up as we went along, and we could do an entire about how fun it was designing the internet and all the mistakes we made. I will take claim for being the person who turned away buying this little company called Google for $10 million because I thought there's no way that search is a viable product offering. So I've made some mistakes along the way, but so I started in tech. And then when I left Yahoo, when it got to be 3,000 people, I realized that I liked the more entrepreneurial, making it up as we go along, kind of a cycle. And so I was intending to get back into high tech, but I got really smitten with the idea of microfinance, small loans to the world's poor so they could build their own way out of business. Coming from Silicon Valley, I know the power of entrepreneurship. I mean, you could bottle it and sell it for $1 million a drop, that energy, and to let people use that to build their own way out of poverty. And I fast forward, was invited to potentially join the board of Grameen Bank, Mohammed Yunus. And I sat as an observer in their board meeting, and I'm looking at the books and I'm saying, wait a minute, you guys are profitable. And your bigger banks can afford to charge lower interest rates because of economies of scale. I said, why aren't you taking investment dollars? And he nearly threw me out. He yelled at me by the whole board. He said, it's unethical to make money while doing good. And that changed my life. I left and I thought, you know what? No, it really isn't. And I started a microfinance fund that really just threw the whole system on its head. Today, the vast majority of money in microfinance is investment capital. So that's kind of a trend for me, is to look at something and say, but wait a minute, we could look at this differently. And so I spent 18 years running impact investment funds, preaching that if the world's problems are going to get solved, you have to have the scale of the capitalist system, which is why it's more ironic than ever that I, of all people, go start a nonprofit. But I do stand corrected, which is that philanthropy plays an important role in de-risking new solutions. And what we're doing is a very new solution. It is very counter to the current status quo thinking. And so we are a nonprofit. I started a few years ago, and really mostly intellectually, because I knew nothing about homelessness, but I knew one thing: whatever we're doing isn't working. We're spending more and more money, and the problem keeps getting worse. Maybe you take a big step back and look at it. And I never intended to start a nonprofit. It was really a group of us just curious. But the more we looked at it, the more it's like, wait a minute, this is solvable. This is solvable. We're just looking at it wrong. And that gets me excited.
That is such a great and epic story. Are you kidding me? Wow. Okay, so let's break it down a couple ways, because when you said, hey, this problem is solvable, and you saw the amount of spending that was happening, just for the people that have only seen the headlines of, hey, we're building homeless housing at 600, 800 grand a million, or $1 million a unit. Like, help us understand what was happening and why you have taken a different perspective or different approach to it.
Sure. And I think at first it's important to understand a couple of fundamental terms and concepts, because that's one of the problems is most people don't. When I say this is solvable, I mean unsheltered homelessness, street homelessness, which is only a small portion of homelessness writ large. Most people in the country who've lost their home at least have access to a shelter or temporary housing. So unsheltered homelessness is what's solvable, because solving homelessness means getting people into permanent housing, right? That's what ends homelessness for that person. And yet when they move from the streets into something temporary, they're still considered homeless. They're just sheltered homeless. And so when I say this is solvable, I mean unsheltered homelessness, because with all due respects, it's 4 walls and a roof. Solving the whole housing crisis, you're the expert. You know that's not so solvable, at least in the near term. And so I believe that we should be prioritizing getting everyone indoors, regardless of how long they get to stay there. Historically, because of the metrics I just explained, our system has prioritized only permanent housing, because technically when you get someone into interim housing, not only has nothing changed because they're still homeless, but in some cases it's worse because now you don't see it. And so there's less political pressure to end homelessness. And so we get the system telling me that any money we spend on anything that isn't permanent is a waste of resources. As a Harvard Business School student and graduate, I looked at it and said, with all due respect, I disagree. And there are a couple of things people don't understand. One is that the cost of leaving people on the streets, that's about $80,000 per person per year. $80,000. The cost to bring them indoors and give them 3 meals a day and supportive services and 24/7 care is $40,000. It's costing us twice what it would cost to solve the problem, to let this problem continue. The problem with that is that $80,000 is spread across so many budgets that you don't see it. Cleaning up feces and needles, right? And emergency room visits and police interactions and wildfires, all those things. And the one department that has the responsibility for homelessness is scored on reducing homelessness, not street homelessness. That in its simplest form is why we have this problem. And when we prioritize permanent housing, as you mentioned, the average cost per unit of permanent housing in our state is over $800,000. It's $1 million in our big cities like San Francisco and LA. And the result of that is for every one lucky person who gets that $1 million apartment, 4 become homeless.
Oh,
Well, you don't have to have a calculator to know we're not going to solve it that way. We're going to have to do something different. And so in our model, we say, let's get everybody indoors into something that's safe, that isn't the quality that they would maybe spend the rest of their life, but who cares? And if you ask these people, do you care if you're permanent in your home? Nothing in life is permanent. I'm not going to live here permanently. For sure, nothing in life is permanent to them. Why do we care that where they are is permanent? That's artificial, right? They don't care. And so I think we should remove the concept of permanent anything and just talk about housing. And that's the important distinction, because shelter has correctly been de-emphasized. A bunk bed in a big warehouse, nobody wants to go. COVID showed us it's not safe. We don't fund shelter other than in places where it's just really cold. But what we build is cabins where people have their own room with a door that locks and they get to stay a while. That, by HUD's definition, is housing. Separate sleeping quarters and a habitual place of residence. Not permanent, but habitual. It's not an overnight stay. So we build what we call interim supportive housing. And we'll talk a little bit about how we do it, but we do it for about the cost of 1/10 of what it costs to build that permanent housing. And you know what? It may not be there permanently, but people love it.
wow. And I got a couple of things to reflect here because you and I both come from this corporate background here. I used to be a management consultant, and I felt like all I used to learn was how to not run a business sometimes as a management consultant. And we use this word in this whole world of real estate and corporate America, this whole buzzword of strategy, right? Big
Mm,
buzzword. And to me, it boils down to how do you allocate resources that are limited against an infinite amount of options? And
mm,
when you just state a couple of facts, hey, it costs 800 grand to build a permanent supportive housing unit, sometimes even 1 million. But for every person we put in there, just 4 more that becomes homeless. That doesn't math. I don't care how bad you are at math, but that does not math at all. And I used to be an EMT. So I was one of those people that would take homeless folks to the emergency rooms. Sometimes we called them freaking flyers because they were trying to get out of the cold. And
yep.
that in of itself adds cost to the entire city. So talk about strategy in the terms of defining it as allocating a resource. Do I really want to spend 80 grand a year when I could be solving the same problem of taking an unsheltered homeless person off the street for 40 grand? That makes a ton of sense to me, policy aside.
So, I always caveat that by saying, because, I'm a business school person, your management consultant, it feels very cold to talk about this in terms of spreadsheets and return on investments and so forth. But if you forgive me that, because recognizing that these are real people, one of the things we've missed is doing a systems analysis of this problem just as if it was a corporation or anything
Yeah.
else. And I have to tell you, if the homelessness system was a corporation, it would be a turnaround. You know what we do in turnarounds? We fire people. We cut factory lines. We make hard decisions. This is a turnaround situation. It's a crisis, right? And so if you want to look at return on investment, scenario A, what we have today, you could not design a more expensive model if you tried. Someone loses their home, they languish on the streets for a decade, is about the average, at $80,000 a year. Then they get $1 million apartment and $20,000 a year of care for the rest of their life, which will be 20 years shorter than it otherwise would have been. You can do that math, right? That's expensive. Or people come in off of the streets, they get an interim housing unit that's about the size of my son's dorm room in college. So don't tell me about housing. It says housing on the USC tuition bill, right? Somebody thinks it's housing. They get into something that costs $50,000, but lasts for 10 years, let's say. So $5,000 per year per person and $40,000 a year of care. Even if only 20% got back on their feet, that return on investment is immediate. But what we've discovered is that when people first become homeless, the vast majority of them do not yet have a debilitating condition that would prevent them from returning to self-sufficiency, about 17%. But being on the streets even a couple of months, that 17% skyrockets. And if you're waiting on the streets for a decade, there's no chance, generalizing, but that very many of those folks are ever going to return to being taxpayers. And so from an investment, return on investment, if we can get everybody indoors, some percent of them become taxpayers. Certainly those who are not going to be able to care for themselves are not on our streets getting worse and more expensive. The streets are not the waiting room, right? So the return on investment, both morally as well as, quite frankly, fiscally, makes all the sense in the world.
I mean, it just makes so much sense because I used to be in the corporate world. We had this mantra called, when we see a problem, to your words, using a turnaround, you got to stop the bleeding. You got to figure out what's causing the problem. You just got to stop it. It doesn't make sense to keep going on. And I have been fortunate. I tell people like my lack of experience has allowed me to look at this problem from a different set of eyes. And looking at how low income housing tax credits sometimes are allocated and seeing how they give the most points to housing that serves the lowest income individuals or gives the most points to homeless folks only, then sometimes you're not creating the best environment for people to succeed and even get back
Mm.
on their feet. So does it become a cycle? Does it become a loop? I don't know, but I can tell you that if affordable housing was solved already, I probably wouldn't be on this podcast talking to you, honestly.
Correct. And one of the things that's really sad about that spiral, and it's a moral conundrum, which is that when we only have one shelter bed for every three who want one, you have to prioritize the people who are the most vulnerable, who have been on the streets the longest, waiting lists and so forth, which means that the person who became homeless yesterday and still has their wits about them is not eligible. Not eligible until their condition has degraded to the point that they make it to the top of the list. Think about what that does at a systems level, right? And it's kind of like during the pandemic when we had too few respirators. The debate was, do you give them to the elderly who are likely to die anyway, or do you give them to the young? It's a horrible moral conundrum. The only way to get out of that is to have enough for everyone so that you have the luxury of having one for somebody who has not been waiting for it. That's how society gets out of this cycle.
Oh, so let's talk about an example how you're doing this because I now I think everybody listening has the background and at least the general knowledge of what's going on and what you're doing and building at a tenth of the cost. That's amazing. But tell us, make it real for us. Like, where are you doing this interim housing type of setups?
Sure. Well, the first thing that happens is I spend a lot of my time having this argument because, to be fair, the system doesn't believe in anything that's not permanent, and therefore there is very little funding for anything that isn't permanent. But if you get away from that for a minute and you've got a city, let's say San Jose, whose mayor is all bought in, feels like it was his campaign promise to end the era of encampments, and he's darn determined to do it. Once that happens, the first thing we do is find vacant land. And in California, land is very expensive. And so we borrow land. I think you can look at it again from a management consulting perspective. You say, what are all the barriers? And systematically, let's knock them down. Land is expensive. Great. We'll borrow vacant land. We don't need to buy it. You can drive down the street. There's so much land available, but somebody's got plans for it someday. And so we take over vacant land temporarily, which means we have to have relocatable housing cabins, right? So we buy from different manufacturers. The good news is that the ADU laws and all the tax credits for manufactured housing and so forth, there are hundreds of these vendors. Heck, you can buy a tiny home on Amazon, right? So there's no supply constraint. We buy based on what the specific project needs are. But in general, we bring these little cabins to the site, and then building codes are, of course, onerous. But this is a crisis. Crisis. The state of California has declared a shelter crisis. And when you do that, you can use crisis waivers just like FEMA does. I can tell you when there's an earthquake, FEMA does not go get zoning permissions. They don't do environmental reviews. They don't ask the neighborhood for approval, right? And so when a city has declared a shelter crisis, they can waive all state and local ordinances to the extent that strict adherence would in any way hinder their ability to address the crisis. So the state of California in their building code has an appendix that is minimum safety standards that are appropriate. 2 means of egress, 64 square feet, this kind of 1 hour fire rating, whatever it is, right? So there are minimum codes, but then it allows them to waive the ratio of electric vehicle chargers to parking spaces. right? I mean, all these aspirational building codes that are great, but that's how we got to $1 million a room. And the nice thing is that because it's a crisis, a city can waive all that stuff without it being a slippery slope where the next developer says, well, how come I have to have electric vehicle chargers, right?
Ah,
So it is specifically built for people experiencing homelessness, for people coming off of the streets. And so that's the justification for having a much simpler model. So we borrow vacant land. And by the way, sometimes that land is privately owned. For instance, John Sobrato in San Jose is letting us borrow an acre of land for $1 a year and then gets property tax exemption. So if the private landowner is holding on to land for a project they might do someday, or they're pausing because they're worried about economic conditions, they can let us borrow it and their holding costs are covered, right? And so there's real
smart.
benefit to private landowners. But also there's a lot of government land out there. The one that I crack up is there's a whole corridor being reserved for when high-speed rail comes. Well, I can tell you, we could probably use that land for quite some time. All right. And then when we need to, we pick them up literally with a forklift and relocate them. So when I say them, everyone gets their own room with a door that locks. They come in all different sizes and shapes, but generally the most basic is 64 square feet and got a window, a door, a bed, a desk, an air conditioner, heater. And what the heck else do you need? It's got power, right? But then we'll build them in a community with 24/7 security and beautiful exterior gates that, blend with the local community. And they'll have a shared dining building, a shared bathroom and shower and laundry facility, shared computer labs, shared community spaces, case manager offices. Quite frankly, it's a whole lot like college living, right? And people say, well, they should have their own bathroom and kitchen in their room. But you know what? Little secret. When I went to Stanford freshman year, I didn't have my own bathroom and kitchen. And that wasn't because Stanford couldn't afford it. It's by design. They want you to have your meals together. And we use Gensler, the architecture firm, who has a real challenge because people are only willing to come because they get their private space. They don't want a bunk bed with strangers. So the privacy is the attraction. And yet they learned in the encampments that community is literally survival. If you don't have people watching your back, you won't wake up tomorrow morning. And so it's frightening, the thought initially of going from the streets into your own isolated apartment by yourself. And so they love that community spirit, right? It's not a drawback. It's really a benefit. And so everyone has their own room, but shared facilities. And then the city helps us hire and work with a local supportive services agency that does 24/7 care. Everyone gets assigned a case manager. Let's talk through what's keeping you back. A lot of people have lost their driver's license. Okay, get in my car. We're going to go to the DMV. Let's try to help. And it really plays kind of a sorting mechanism because it gives us a chance once people are stabilized to figure out which ones could reunite with family, which ones could get a job at Home Depot, maybe somewhere less expensive than San Francisco, right? And which ones are going to need permanent care, but they've been stabilized and reacclimated, and they're more ready for when that permanent housing becomes available.
Wow. I mean, first of all, I just like to commend you all on listening to people, not just saying, we're going to give this to them and this is what they want. You actually listen to them because that transition from homelessness to your own private unit, when you came from a community background that you had somebody looking after your stuff on the streets, right? I mean, that's as basic as that.
Well, you
And
know
you
what?
listen.
You know what will blow people's minds, and it does, and it's actually ironically been a detriment, is that people end up getting into this housing and they love it so much, they won't leave. They wait 14 years for that permanent housing assignment and they turn it down. I had one guy who's like, you're going to have to put me on suicide watch. He's like, I don't cook. I don't have that much stuff. I don't need a big apartment. I just need to be here with my people. Well, why has the system decided that that's a failure if we don't make him go to his own apartment, which we did? That's what we have to do. Why? Why are we hung up on what we think the American dream is your own apartment in a high rise? We didn't ask them. They're fine with a $50,000 cabin. And I say 50,000 because, the cabins themselves, depending on which one you buy, they're sort of 20,000. But then you have to do offices and case managers and all that kind of stuff. But we use the emergency waivers as aggressively as we can. And so we, of course, make sure that they're safe, but it really comes down to what the city is willing to waive. And we spend a lot of our energy convincing them that they have the ability and should waive. And so, for instance, it's an interesting, philosophical issue, is that the fire marshals often say you have to put fire sprinklers in the units. Well, let me tell you, it's 64 square feet. There's 24/7 staff. We've got two means of egress. Really? We have to do fire sprinklers? Because we don't run water to the cabins. It doubles the cost. And you get a fire marshal who'll say, well, you can't convince me to treat these people's life safety with any less regard than everyone else. And that's valid until you stop and understand that the alternative is an encampment where their fire life risk is dramatically higher. It's not choosing between one apartment and another. And yet the fire marshal only has to sign off on the building community. He doesn't sign off on that encampment. If he did, he'd be far more interested in seeing us do twice as many units without fire sprinklers. There's a lot of fire hydrants around, right? And so it's a really interesting. So we find that what we think cities ought to waive, they're often not willing to. And so we do a lot of peer pressure. San Francisco waived that. And we have Gensler, a leading architecture firm who can write very technical code analysis explaining why they should waive it, because they have the ability to waive it. It's their choice. And as you can see, we go through a lot of that. But if people waive what they are able to waive and we believe they ought to waive, we can easily build these for $50,000 a unit.
Wow. I mean, I love that we kind of got into problem solving. But let me take the conversation maybe one step up with you, Elizabeth, because I think the solution is great. It makes a lot of sense financially, and it makes a lot of sense just with listening to what people want. But for people that are listening to this the first time, right, this is still a very new sort of partnership structure. So tell us, educate us. What are everybody's like roles and responsibilities? So it sounds like there's Dignity Moves, there's a builder, there's a city. Maybe the
Yep.
city's the landowner. Tell us the roles and responsibilities of everybody that's sort of involved or might be involved on a project with you.
Sure. So let's start with a piece of land that's owned by a county. And so Dignity Moves will sign a lease to have access to it. The city will still own the property. We bring these units on. So we have Gensler as the architecture firm. We contract with a general contractor, either locally, although government doesn't have a strong preference. We use Swinnerton, which is a national, very well respected general contractor. And one reason is that putting these things together, it's a little bit like IKEA. The first time is really hard. And then once you've done it, like it kind of gets a lot easier. So Swinnerton has a lot of experience with it. And so we bring in, obviously, and then electrical consultants and all that. So Dignity Moves oversees the permitting process together with Gensler and Swinnerton. So we oversee the construction, and then the city hires the supportive services agency, city or county, right, that kind of takes over after we've got the project completed. And so they are then responsible for 24/7 operations and property management and so forth, contracted directly with the city. Technically, once a project has been built, Dignity Moves steps away. We're not involved in it, although we do stay involved informally to share best practices, standardized reporting of outcomes, and that kind of thing. So the units themselves are typically owned by the city or the county, along with the land. Although I say typically loosely, because some cities don't want to own them, so we're happy to. Some cities want to gift them to the supportive services operator. It doesn't matter. The units themselves are not really the bulk of the asset. And the nice thing about them being relocatable, though, is that when a project landowner needs their land back, we can literally pick them up with a forklift or put wheels on them and take them to the next city or the next region. So you can dial up and dial down your homelessness capacity as you need. And I want to kind of go into one point that we haven't talked on yet, which is NIMBYism and the neighborhood opposition, because that's the elephant in the room. And whoever's listening, if you're in a city, you're thinking, yeah, that sounds great, but no neighborhood would ever let us put a shelter in the neighborhood, right? And I really think we've cracked that one too, because what we do is we make a compact with the neighborhood that takes the shelter, interim housing, but it functions as shelter. And we invite in the people sleeping in the immediate area, kind of in concentric circles until it's full. And then you cordon that area off and it becomes a no sleeping zone. So that neighborhood is what sees instantly the visible and measurable difference, right? In downtown Santa Barbara, we're literally next door to Morgan Stanley's private client services. Talk about concerns. The best thing that ever happened to them, because the first people to get beds were sleeping in their parking lot, right? Their private client
Ah,
customers had to step over. You know, when we went to San Jose to get our second project approved, tons of people showed up opposed because they were pissed it wasn't in their neighborhood. I'm not kidding.
wow.
I'm not kidding. You can harness that because those people are in your neighborhood. Would you rather have them unshowered, unkept, off their meds, disgruntled, hungry? Or would you rather have those same people behind a beautiful gate with 24/7 staff and care? There is not a third option. So if you care about the safety of your neighborhood and the cleanliness, you just got to take a thought and say, wait a minute, actually, this is a really good trade, right? As long as there are rules, we don't allow any walk-ups, there's no standing in line. You get assigned this from a office somewhere. You don't come to the gate, no loitering, right? And we really can assure the neighborhood that their neighborhood won the lottery.
Wow. That's such a great way to phrase it. It's like that neighborhood won the lottery for this problem that they've been trying to clamor on all of our politicians to solve for. And so let me say it back to you, right, Elizabeth, because I want to make sure I understood the whole process fully. It's so someone might have a piece of land. It might be the city, it might be the county, it might be a private landowner. They would lease it to Dignity Moves on probably a very flexible contract, what it sounds like, so that they can always have the flexibility to build on it when the time comes. And you are the one that are sort of project managing the entire process, which means you're the manager. You handle bringing the architect, the engineer, the cities all to the table to discuss how to get the project approved, right?
And you missed
Okay.
one step, which is we help put together the funding. So,
Yes,
so
that's what I
we
was trying to
find the
understand.
land and then we help the city pull up the funding. We use philanthropy. Philosophically, I don't think that we should fund a project 100% philanthropically. It is
Hmm.
government's obligation. But if we bring, say, 20% of the project budget in philanthropy, all of a sudden city council is way more motivated to find the other 80%. And so we often have
Mm.
developers. I'll praise John Sobrato again in San Jose as an example. He says, I'll put $1 million towards any project you do in Silicon Valley. So imagine now we find a piece of land and we go to city council and we've already got $1 million if and only if they come up with the other four. Well, all of a sudden it unlocks government funding much more. But we also apply for state grants, home key, encampment resolution, and we do the heavy lifting on those applications because particularly smaller cities, they don't have the resources to do all of that. Whoever's responsible for homelessness is also responsible for COVID, wildfires, a bunch of other stuff. They don't have the bandwidth, and so we do the heavy lifting, and we'll raise philanthropy, apply for grants, help them figure out between Prop One money. So anyway, we help figure out the funding, and then we oversee the project budgets and the delivery and the timelines and so forth.
Got it. That's so helpful because the city must be wondering, I'm a small city. We don't have that much budget. I get the savings that you're pitching me, but I still need to find the money right now. But when you can lead the way and lead the charge and show that you already got them 20% of the way, that makes it a little bit better of a conversation internally within the city. So that makes a ton of sense. So, and on top of that, it seems like you're using the project management resources from your team to kind of usher along this entitlement process. Their commitment as a city is still to put in, maybe it's the building department, the planning department, who kind of handles all the neighborhood meetings, if you will. Do you coordinate that or do
We
they do
help
it
a
all?
lot with that. I mean, ultimately, the city, usually the elected officials, need to be the ones that stand on the podium and say, this is why we're doing this, and I believe in it, and this is going to be the right thing. So, the streamlining is one of the big pieces when you talked about the city's responsibilities. We have seen San Francisco, we got our permits in 3.5 weeks. That's a
Oh, whoa.
historic first in San Francisco. In other cities, it's taken them 6 months to turn around the first round of comments. It varies widely, but if the elected officials decide that we want to use emergency powers and streamline this, then it's miraculous how quickly it can be done. And it can also give you examples of the wrong way to do it and make it twice as expensive and twice as long as it needs to. And so that's a really big variable. And in fact, we've gotten to the point where unless we get a commitment from a city that they're going to treat this like an emergency, just as if it was FEMA, then I've got better things to do. I mean, it's really a spirit of partnership, and they need to get, to get on board with the urgency, and you can't just do things, the usual way. This is not permanent housing.
I love that. And sometimes people come to me with an affordable housing project, and one of my first questions is like, "Well, do they really want you there, or is it like a soundbite?" Because this is a very steep hill you're climbing,
Right.
and you got to pick your time, your energy, your resources to spend it on, because you could go to a much flatter road, get your project approved way faster, and maybe just make the other city jealous of what you got going on, because
Yep.
that goes into that jackpot conversation that you were talking about for the neighborhoods.
And the
Um,
interesting thing is that we're a nonprofit, but we're not like somebody else going to a city trying to get a government contract and make a bunch of money. In fact, ironically, generally, we're coming to them offering to help find the funding and give them a shelter. And I'll tell you, a lot of government civic servants, they don't understand. They're just so not used to it. And so Dignity Moves makes our money by adding a developer's fee to a project budget. Although almost without exception, because we are raising some philanthropy, we raise more than our developer fee. And so we really are doing it for free, right? I mean, they're getting a free shelter if we apply to Home Key and so forth. And so, in exchange, we expect the cities to be good partners. And they have the authority and the power to waive things. And we need them to.
Right, because I mean, your staff, your folks, still need to put food on their table. I mean, it's as simple
Well,
as that.
I'm not kidding. We've done projects. My San Francisco project was $32,000 per room. Using that same vendor, we've had budgets at $110,000 per room. Same vendor. What varies is the city's rigidity and whether they're going to insist on fire sprinklers and permanent foundations and yada yada, right? And they don't need to do all those things, but they can make it 3 times, 4 times as expensive as it needs to. And so we're starting to have those conversations up front in the honeymoon phase, so to speak, when we've still got the mayor's attention, and say, are you going to treat this like a crisis, or are you going to try to do it the way you do everything else? And that's just not the spirit of what we're doing. This is an emergency. I can tell you, if there was a hurricane, we wouldn't be taking 6 months to turn around building permit responses.
Right, because you got your own resources to allocate. If you got to go to the city that wants you there, and that's you can turn around and make the biggest impact as soon as possible. So this is so interesting. What about thinking from a developer's mindset? Like, oh, you mentioned sprinklers, but what about water, sewer,
Mm.
electric? What does that look like on a site? What should a city think about when it comes to utilities? Because that probably helps you get informed about what is the best piece of land to possibly consider for something like this.
Right. Great questions. So, first of all, for the units, they typically only have electricity, although we do have some that we build bathrooms in them. So, for instance, the hospitals are big funders of what we do, because if you look at the pie chart of the cost of people being on the streets, about half of it is the emergency room visits and so forth that you've mentioned. And so when they fund units like Common Spirit, Dignity Health down in Santa Maria, they wanted bathrooms in them because those would be for people coming out of a medically, tentative situation. So, but that aside, first of all, with electric, there is no reason for us to dig trenches and connect to the grid, particularly if we're talking about temporary projects. The units themselves, batteries in the wall and solar panels, right? And then when the project's over, you can literally relocate them and not have left any work in the ground. You got to think Burning Man, kind of leave no trace, right? I want to spend as little money as I can in the ground because it doesn't relocate with us. So, or we can connect to the grid. In San Francisco, we literally run a cable from the next door building. Now, that's a city that's willing to let you do that, right? Other cities are making us trench utilities straight through to the grid. So it varies widely, but we'll run electric, and then we'll have one building that is bathroom, shower, and laundry in one kind of shipping container format, or depending on how many people there are, maybe 2 of them, but in the same place. So you've got one water sewer hookup that you need to do. And so there's one place, and we will locate that wherever is the closest to the utilities. Now, for private developers, if we're borrowing their land and they have plans for it next, then we'll put the bathrooms wherever they need their utility lines,
Ah,
right?
there you
So we
go.
can help them jumpstart whatever they're doing using our emergency codes and our expedited processes. So we can make it really worth the while. But a private developer lets us use their land, property tax exemption. We can help them jumpstart their permits and doing some of the legwork and so forth. And then if we're inviting in the people sleeping in the immediate area, their property value goes up because they're in the neighborhood that doesn't have any tents. So if you're a commercial developer, you'd be all over this. Now, I'll be fair, they have valid concerns, one of which is the optics of evicting a homeless shelter when they're ready to build their shopping mall. There's obviously concerns about liability. If you've got the right mindset, you can get over that, right? And one thing you can do is literally agree in advance to how long the project will be there and have the occupancy permit expire in 3 years and we can make it so they don't look like the bad guy evicting the homeless shelter that if it's always the plan, but they've got to be philosophically on board.
Well, that makes so much sense, though. I mean, especially if we can get the property tax exemptions, and you can also help a developer potentially speed up getting some of the horizontal work done in place with utilities, water, sewer, power. I don't know how many times I've heard from developers where they say the power company is taking so long just coming to come out here and serve getting power to my site. I can't even start building, and
Yep, takes 18
people,
months. And you know
this
what
is
else you
real
get?
time.
You know what else you get as a private landowner? A whole lot of goodwill with the city. I have to tell you,
Yes.
John Sobrato gets thanked in every single city council meeting I've ever been in, even when there isn't an item on the agenda that has to do with his program. They're so grateful because, I mean, obviously, right? I mean, this is the number one voter issue. There is not a mayor who isn't exhausted of getting phone calls when somebody's sleeping in front of Starbucks. They are so thrilled when the private sector is willing to help out and let them borrow land and so forth. And we're also seeing philanthropy get really excited about this because it's very quick, very visible, and can be done truly at scale. And what we're seeing more and more of is cities starting to work towards what we call functional zero unsheltered, where a municipality functionally has enough beds for everyone who needs one so that no one needs to resort to, and nor will they be allowed to sleep on the streets within the city limits. And so that's what starts to get everybody really excited. If you look at a little city that's got 100 people on the streets, I can go through all the analysis, but the expert, math says that you would need about 60 beds, about 60%. You build a little shelter, 60 interim housing units, and then you cordon it off and make this a no camping zone, you're done. You've solved the problem, right? And you're not chipping away at it one room at a time. And I have to tell you, when an elected official stands up there and says, we're going to end it, we know how many beds that needs, what the resources are, philanthropy shows up like you'd be dizzy. But they become disillusioned. They don't see the progress when we're doing $1 million units at a time. But this is the kind of thing that can really reignite optimism, because I think truly the only thing standing in our way of solving unsheltered homelessness is we don't think it's possible. We've kind of given up. In the back of our minds, it's just
Yeah.
too complex. Oh, let me tell you, you take the number of people, multiply it by 0.6, multiply it by $50,000, and there is a number. There is a finish line. Now, we can argue whether we're going to choose to allocate resources to that, even though it would be a big return on investment. But we can no longer tell ourselves it's not possible. It's very, very possible.
And this is why I brought you on the podcast. Because I'm just so, just like you, I used to hear this thing was like, you know what, homelessness is such a big problem. Like whenever you bring it up, people are like, oh, yeah, but it's so complex. Like, and because of the level of complexity, they say, let's not continue the conversation because their mind doesn't go anywhere. And then I
Yep.
hear from other folks, just like foundations, where they're tired of hearing about permanent supportive housing because they all they do is hear on the headlines like we spent 800 grand a unit, we spent $20 billion in the state of California, hasn't got us anything, right? It's these narratives that makes people shy away until you show up and show why you are worthy of their donations, of their contributions, of their energy. And sometimes you can only show that you're worthy of that contribution if you have shown that you are truly putting your headspace and energy towards looking at an alternative solution. Simple as that.
And Kent, you said something that triggered a topic we've not covered appropriately, which is the person's own choice and agency. And I'm as guilty of any of thinking of these people in inventory and flow and throw through. But these are humans. And I think the most important thing that we do is look at their ability to make choices. And one of the reasons as society we've told ourselves this problem isn't solvable is because we think, oh, well, they won't take it. They want to be outside. I've never, ever met anyone who prefers a cement pillow. Never. They prefer it to what they're being offered. And so we need to take a step back and look at the customer, right? So they don't want a bunk bed in a big warehouse. Fine. Maybe they've come out of incarceration and they don't want to be in walls at all. They want to be in a tent. Fine. We'll have a supervised tent location, right? What if they want to go into recovery? Quite frankly, we see a lot of people who don't go to shelter because they don't want to be around drug users because they're trying to get clean. Fine. Let's have a site where nobody's using drugs, right? What if they don't want any rules at all? They're just a freebie and they want to live in a place where all is fine. We'll have a low barrier site. Come as you are. There'll just be security, right? You've got to offer choices, and one of them needs to be geographic because the people are sleeping where they want to be sleeping. Maybe they've got a friend they can couch surf with on weekends. Maybe mom's down the street. You can't ship them across the county, right? So you need to offer choice, cabin choices, safe sleeping, safe parking, a bus ticket to another city, a whole portfolio of choices. When you walk out to an encampment and you're offering them 4 or 5 choices and they turn them all down, I'll go out on a limb and tell you they ought not arrested. They ought to be assessed. At that point, they probably need to see a psychiatrist and have some sort of an assessment. And it often gets spun into criminalizing homelessness. But I got to tell you, if you've got, in San Jose, they make 3 different offers before they haul you in to be assessed. And if somebody's offered 3 different things, first of all, that's a success that the city has the luxury of having 3 choices for somebody. God, we should just celebrate right there. But yeah, if somebody turns those down, but they don't. The outreach workers have told me they've yet to have anybody turn it down when they've been offered a DignityMoves room. They have hundreds of people on the waiting list. So we can't tell ourselves it's because people don't want it. And we can't tell ourselves we can't afford to solve it. When you look
Well, I
at
love that
it,
you. Sorry, I love that you kind of share that there's flexibility in even like the interim housing encampments that you guys set up because, well, now I'm thinking, well, how do you go about? I'm sure the public has asked you this question. How do you go about like selecting who's going to go here or there? Is it purely by geography? Like we're in this neighborhood, so we're going to offer to these folks sleeping on these streets first. What does that look like for the screening process and selecting folks to come in?
That's a great question, and it's morphing over time. So today and in general, there's something called a coordinated entry system. So when somebody becomes homeless, they go get registered and they get assessed, which is a horrible process, and they get a vulnerability score, which of course is higher if they've been physically assaulted, and it's higher if they're so they get assessed a score, and then the next person on the waiting list anywhere in the county gets assigned to the next bed. That's the standard. We, of course, as you've heard, come in, and one of the first things we do is help them modify that. And the way we justify modifying it is because we brought some philanthropy. Generally, we find that the departments don't want to be held to that exact wait list system, but they have to have something to point to justify modifying it. So we prioritize the people geographically in that immediate area. Then they cordon off that area and there's no camping. But once the person is into a facility, now you can relocate them, right? So you could have a women's only facility, you could have a veterans facility, one for drug users, and it's not sharing a wall with the guy who's got to get up at 6 a.m. and get to work, right? And so lots of times it ends up meaning, the option of relocating, but that we start with whoever's in that immediate area, although they have to go get registered. You can't just walk up and knock on the door and stand in line. We promise that to the neighbors. There's nobody loitering around outside for any reason. We have to really stand firm to the promise that your neighborhood is going to be darn glad that you did this, and then the next neighborhood over is going to be calling. And that's how you get the momentum, and that's how the elected officials start getting really excited about this rather than dreading telling their constituents, sorry, you're going to have a shelter. I mean, now we're kind of elbowing each other out of the way, being the ones to get the next.
Yeah, it just makes so much sense, and I love how much effort you and your team like put into it. What about after folks are in the encampment and the whole place is set up? What Who's responsible for funding at that point in time? Are you still helping the city look for grants at that point, or are the cities just funding out their city budget? Help the cities understand what does that look like in terms of just permanent supportive services, 24/7 security. I'm assuming and just going forward the support and the maintenance of that site.
Yeah, great question. And the precursor to that you didn't ask is how long people typically stay. That's also one of the things that we get. So the average today is about 8 months, although we're also finding more and more of a feeling that that should not be a limitation. That I believe if somebody gets into the interim housing and they're happy there, we should not be forcing them into permanent, especially if we don't have enough supply of permanent, right? And so that leads to the leading question, which is today they don't pay rent. It is technically shelter in the system. And I adamantly believe we need to let people pay rent and have the right to stay as long as the facility is
Yes.
there and have some tenants' rights. So Sacramento, God bless them, they're going to be the first. I've seen them that they're going to start charging rent to their tiny home communities. And I really think for a lot of reasons that gives the person the dignity. So,
Yes.
but today, absent rents and absent rental subsidies, the ongoing operating costs are covered by government sources. It's typically the county in our nation, in our country, funding for behavioral health care, supportive services, food security. That all flows through the counties. It is not the city's responsibilities. That said, it's often the city that is most interested in seeing these interim solutions. So we do find that sometimes cities do tap into their own budgets, but it's not the way it should be. There's also a lot of money now for behavioral health that's come down after Proposition 1 in California. And so that money specifically for behavioral and mental health care, Prop 1 funding is a big chunk. And interestingly, Medicaid, because Medicaid has discovered that unsheltered homelessness is a medical issue. Housing is health. And so Medicaid will reimburse for the housing navigators, the intensive case management, will reimburse for a lot of the supportive services. So we stitch all that together. It's challenging, but
Yeah, it's a lot of work. It's no easy feat by any means, but it wasn't impossible when he approved that through and through. So let me I know we're almost at time, but for a city manager or some city official that's listening to this podcast for the first time, what do you think are like the first two or three steps that they need to take to start this process of going down a road of a partnership with Dignity Moves and your team?
so the first one is find a piece of land. Rule of thumb, the right number of units, there are economies of scale. And so we like to target about 100 units as a median number, which is about an acre of land. So we'll go a lot smaller. Our project in Santa Barbara, the first one we did is on a quarter of an acre and it's 35 units. But if you find a piece of land, ideally flat, ideally paved, really needs to be close to public transportation, where people are. They shouldn't be off in the middle of nowhere. But if you identify a site that's available for, say, a minimum of 5 years, again, that's not hard and fast, but it's a lot of work to set these up. You don't want to do it if it's going to be shorter than that. So public land or private, could be Caltrans, whatever. If you find a site that you want to start looking towards, then that's when you call us and we will do a fit test and a draft budget, give you a sense of what it might look like. And then we help you start socializing it. So we start going to the local foundations. We start helping with the city council members. We warm them up to the philosophy that we've talked about in the strategy, the framework, and sort of help try to pull it all together.
Wow, that's a lot of steps, but it's also super clear because
Find a
now,
piece of find a piece of land and then call me. It's not that many
yeah,
steps.
find a piece of land and we'll figure everything else out because you have had the team, and not only have you had the team, but you've actually executed these projects in Santa Barbara and San Jose, and you've seen what works and what doesn't work so that you can start setting those expectations for those cities that actually want to solve this problem. And I think if you're an elected official today and you want to solve homelessness, you better pay attention because you need to show your constituents that you are being resourceful with their tax money, their tax
Yes.
dollars that they work so hard to earn and pay out. And they want you to be a good steward of those resources by thinking outside the box instead of just going down the same trend that everybody has.
It's an innovative model. It sounds simple, but it's innovative. In fact, speaking of innovative, we're even using a manufacturer that's 3D printed. They use 150,000 recycled water bottles per room, and we're 3D printing them. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting innovation.
Whoa, that is very clever.
And by the way, 11 cities open today. So San Francisco, Santa Barbara, Santa Maria, Roanoke Park, Alameda, Thousand Oaks, San Jose, and we've got another dozen or so in the works: Ojai, Watsonville, Modesto, San Bernardino. I mean, all up and down the state. So if people are interested in seeing what it might look like, that's always a first step as well.
Yeah, and where can they see pictures or videos of the projects that you have done so that they can actually put a visual to the projects that you're putting together?
DignityMoves.org. Got all that up on the website. There's even a playbook, because we don't need to do this just ourselves. We're trying to inspire other people to do it. So we literally have a playbook on our website of the blow by blow, step by step, how to replicate this.
Wow. And let me ask. So, Elizabeth, the reason I started this podcast 3 years ago is because I grew up in affordable housing, and when I started this podcast 3 years ago, Elizabeth, people have always said, "Kent, you're never going to be able to solve this problem," and I always just thought about housing as a fundamental right, but more importantly, I just knew we were going to eventually get all the pieces to the puzzle. So, why do you think affordable housing, particularly the lack of supply of affordable housing, has been like so hard to solve for?
Oh, and I will tell you that the homelessness problem we have is absolutely directly because of the housing crisis. There, we have all these myths that people come to California because it's sunny. By the way, if you are unsheltered, California is the last place you want to come, because California has half of the nation's unsheltered. We have the shortest number of beds ratio to people who need them of anywhere in the country. So the myth that people come here to get services, that's a myth as well. The reason we have this unsheltered problem is directly our cost to build affordable housing. And in California, like we said, the average cost per unit of permanent supportive housing is about $800,000. The average nationally is $300,000. That's why California has a homelessness problem writ large. And it tends to be because every time we have a new aspirational, we'll use the example of electric vehicle chargers to parking spaces, right? Really great, right? You add the next one and the next one and the next one, and you never see bills that reverse these legislative additions. It just keeps, adding and adding and adding. And they're all very well-meaning, and they're all environmentally sound and all the rest. But one after the other, we have made it so that it is $1 million a unit in our state. And until we solve that we will have a housing crisis. But people will not be waiting on our streets. The streets will not be the waiting room while we figure that out.
And that is how you begin to at least solve the problem, if not end it all in its entirety. So, Elizabeth, this has been such a fun conversation. I mean, it seems like you guys are growing all the time. How do I help you attract the talent? Like, what kind of talent are you looking for your team to kind of help you further your mission further?
So I need project managers, people who come out of the real estate development world, who know what they're doing and are willing to break all the rules they've lived by, right?
Yes.
So developers are used to having projects take a decade, every I dotted, every T crossed. People who know the right way to get building permits and are frustrated enough at it that they know exactly the right way and are darn determined to convince cities to waive all the things they've had to work under. So people who've got the gravitas to look at a building department official and with knowledge explain why we should not have to do this structural foundation that does such and such, and has the sense of urgency of, we want to build these things in 4 months, not 4 years, right? And so it's a personality type. And I was told by one of my board members, because I said, I need people who have real estate development experience, who are entrepreneurial. And he looked at me and said, I'm going to be honest with you, that's an oxymoron. It doesn't exist, right? People self-selected into this industry that takes forever and is very detailed and very perfectionistic. So that's what I need, is people with entrepreneurial spirit. And of course, we need philanthropy. We're not like a normal nonprofit that has to raise money every year just to stay afloat, because we do have our earned income. from our developers' fees. But as we talked about, it's really helpful to have kind of a slush fund, so to speak, to pledge towards projects. But the other thing is those developer fees, we earn them after we have a project in place and we're building it. And I need to invest up front in sales and business development and project managers to get more projects so that we can then support ourselves. So what I really need more than anything is really convincing business development people who could go out to those cities and talk them into doing the right thing.
Well, well, it starts with someone that's listening today that
I
wants to
hope
make a
so.
difference with their time, their energy, their resources. Because I bet you know someone in your city, or you know a landowner, or if you're listening to this, that you can learn how to be creative. Maybe it's a private landowner, and maybe you can tell them, "Hey, you get your property taxes exempted while you get your horizontal stuff in place. Make it a win-win." Or maybe you are in the city yourself, and you're like, "Oh, we got this parking lot over there. It's not
Exactly.
it's right already an encampment. Why don't I turn it into something that's actually more efficient and actually helps more people at the same time?" Maybe you're in the city of LA. You got the Olympics coming down. How about you solve this problem before the Olympics start? How
I
about that?
love it. You're a great salesman. You've got it squarely on. It's all hands on deck. This problem affects us all. We've all got to come together and just decide to stop it. It can be done. We just have to choose to do it. We'll be glad we did.
That's right. And I know that, Elizabeth, I'm just so grateful that you came on the podcast. I hope my daughter, she's only 4, but I hope she watches this podcast one day and takes whatever impossible problem that she might face when she grows up, and I can show her this episode. Well, just like everyone said, homelessness was impossible. Look what Elizabeth did.
Oh,
And
thank
I'm
you.
so glad you set an example. I'm so glad you went out there, put yourself on a limb, and was willing to have those difficult conversations, not just with the cities, but with philanthropists that might have been getting a little tired of the story about homelessness. And that
Yep,
takes a lot.
we
Truly,
all
I'm
are.
so grateful for someone like you in this world. And I can't wait to listen to your journey more.
Oh, that's so kind of you. Thank you, Kat. Thrilled to be here.
All right.
Appreciate you.
Hey, for people that want to reach out to you, Elizabeth, should they find you on your website, on LinkedIn? Where can they reach out to you?
Sure. Elizabeth at dignitymoves.org or go to our website and there's a contact us page.
All right. And we are
Thank you.
out. Thanks, Elizabeth.